Hey, remember the 90s? Horror in the 90s was an extremely odd time for filmmakers and fans. But by the late 90s, the transition had fully become about meta horror. Like most of the people subscribed to this channel, I grew up in the 90s. A weird, creative, and odd time for cinema in general, especially when it came to indie cinema, horror, and basically blockbusters. While I didn't start watching horror films until I was in my mid to late teens, my older sister had an obsession with horror films that eventually bled into my own love of cinema in general. When I was younger, the thing that drew me to movies in the first place was the same thing that I've always truly loved about horror: the level of creativity and pure, unadulterated spectacle. Two things which I think embodies great cinema, frankly. It's why today I'm going back to a forgotten franchise that you may or may not have heard of called Wishmaster. I'll be going through this horror franchise and talking about the production, why I love this franchise overall, and eventually ranking the entire franchise. But first, let's start with how the hell this franchise came to be. Now, speaking of the 90s, let's talk about historical context. 1990 became a threshold for horror cinema as essentially franchises started dying out. The 90s overall was a truly creatively bankrupt period for horror, and especially the early 90s, everybody was kind of confronted with the fact that the 80s had given us a glut of original and fantastic horror that, by 1991, had been run to the ground. Too many sequels for people to count, reboots and cultural horror were a confusing concept to even begin with, and some of the best horror directors of the 70s and 80s were now essentially household names doing other great and award-winning work. That is until 1996, when Wes Craven came in and changed the game for pretty much the third time in his career. Wes Craven's Scream, obviously written by Kevin Williamson, created an iconic franchise which made fun of that creative bankruptcy. Wes Craven banked big on this back with New Nightmare, however, it didn't have its full effect until Williamson joined the amazing work that was Scream. Not only has it spawned a multi-decade 7-film franchise, but by the time Scream came out, it was truly a one-of-a-kind meta-commentary on horror films, cinema, and why classics truly stick around. Once the two masterminds behind this work finally accepted that they had a huge hit on their hand, both Williamson and Craven got to work with getting projects greenlit for TV and film. Williamson went on to create the incredibly successful and weirdly semi-autobiographical maudlin teen drama Dawson's Creek, and Wes Craven had a few ideas of his own. In 1996, Wishmaster went into production between the success of Scream 1 and the shooting of Scream 2. While Wes Craven's name is on the package, as you can see here, Craven was simply an EP on the project, but it was Sam Raimi who weirdly suggested a good friend of his, a man named Robert Kurtzman, to direct the film. Sam had seen Kurtzman's first film, The Demolitionist, an extremely low-budget horror action film with dozens of amazing practical effects. Like, you can just see here, he knew what he was doing. Raimi looked at the project and wondered, if he could do that for just over $1 million, what could he do with a little over 5 times that? Wishmaster is Robert Kurtzman's second film, but many people would know him as one-third of K&B Effects Group, the award-winning special effects company behind Evil Dead 2, From Dusk Till Dawn, Army of Darkness, Cabin Fever, Vanilla Sky, just to name a few. Kurtzman had just had a minor hit as a co-producer on From Dusk Till Dawn in 1996, a story he originally rewrote for Quentin Tarantino to work into a full feature with Robert Rodriguez at the helm. By the time production had finished on the film, Kurtzman was ready to talk about what would be next. Kurtzman was done with Dawn, and he was tapped by Craven to work on Wishmaster, an essentially perfect project for him. An effects-heavy creature feature about an evil genie who grants wishes. Fairly simple and straightforward. But what about the story? Enter Peter Atkins. Atkins was originally pitched on the concept in 1996. He felt it was fairly straightforward, but the idea of an evil genie just granting wishes as a horror film...
have you ever thought about writing a movie about an evil genie? And my reaction initially, I got to admit, was the same as everybody else's might be, which was no. But they gave me literally hundreds of Xerox sheets of research material, and it was very, very interesting.
He thought the idea was ridiculous. It's so great to see Atkins talk honestly about the script that he would later eventually write and how he approached the Jinn character. While Atkins was originally hesitant to write a story about a creepy evil genie, eventually he was talked into it and was given dozens of pages in the form of historical and mythological looks at the Jinn, basically the origins for the genie, and how it could be tapped into a horror concept. Production then began in early 1997 with a script ready based on a script by Atkins. Atkins at this point was successfully writing the Hellraiser sequels, specifically 2, 3, and Pinhead Goes Hawaiian. There's an amazing documentary included on the original DVD called Making Wishes, which breaks down the production of the film, and it's amazing to see how Kurtzman, Atkins, the cast, the crew, the effects team, all approach the film to try and be as creative, practical, unique as possible. Kurtzman, having such a strong history with the effects and stuntmen and working with low-budget teams, you can see how much passion he has in this behind-the-scenes behind-the-scenes doco, and shows his level of craftsmanship and imagination is in every single sequence he directs. Especially on such a limited budget and schedule, Kurtzman was the right person for this film. You can even see little glimpses in the storyboards and how Kurtzman and the team had a real vision of this nightmarish and almost ghoulish horror film that translated really well into the final product just based on tone, color grading, and how the actors portray these evil and good characters. I have to say, the MVP of this entire franchise is this man, Andrew Divoff, and we will talk about him and why he's so great, but seeing how he worked with Kurtzman and Atkins to build the character from the ground up is fascinating, and I highly recommend. The actual documentary itself is available for free on YouTube, or you can get it in this Blu-ray, which I purchased. To talk specifically about Divoff, at least in his roles before Wishmaster, he was a great B-movie character actor. He was largely known for playing villains or just one-off henchmen. Specifically, he's most well known as the number 2 henchman Boris Bazlev in Oscar-nominated action flick, This Is True, Air Force One. He's the guy who gets his shit rocked by the president, obviously a role that Harrison Ford was very common with.
I'm the President of the United States.
But seeing how Divoff plays this slimy, evil Russian dude, it's pretty good. I like it, as much as I don't like Air Force One, and especially not the effects, which have aged very poorly. However, both Air Force One and Wishmaster were released actually weirdly within months of each other in 1997, and it's also great to see Divoff talk about the process of creating this character and focusing on him being the hero of his own story. I mean, the film is literally called Wishmaster, unless you're in some Spanish-speaking regions where it was translated to Wishmaster, the Master of Desires. But still, I get that Divoff was essentially so excited to play a character with such heft, and especially one that he could really, really contort into somebody who can embody the physical manifestation of pure evil, both in human and in creature form. Seeing Divoff play both the human and creature form of Wishmaster is fascinating to see, as he turns on the charm as a master manipulator as a human, but even as a creature, he doesn't drop that evilness for a second. I think honestly one thing that truly makes him terrifying is the voice.
Run, insect. Run. Tell those you will what you will.
Divoff's voice, which you can see in interviews, it's quite deep. He's almost like a baritone. But the voice that he gives the Wishmaster is almost like the devil himself just gently whispering into your ear. And that manifests itself as such a great, horrific character. It honestly sounds like a mix of sulfur and lava and concrete being just mixed around in one of those big concrete mixing machines. I don't know what they're called. I'm gonna look it up. Okay, this is what I'm referring to. Anyway, it sounds like a mix in every single line he delivers, and it oozes through the screen in such a way that you just want to know more about what he is and what he's going to do.
Nobody home.
Even in purely what I imagine is difficult to sit through makeup, Divoff is amazing. And also seeing the incredible work from K&B Effects and the makeup team, Divoff is able to move his face so much, and you can see, even though it has multiple layers here, you can see some of the makeup and effects work here. Divoff even asked to see the dailies of the film to make sure his expressions were actually coming through with the heavy makeup. And it was. You can see in the final product, it's amazing. The makeup team did a fucking astounding job, and frankly, you can see that it pays off as Divoff morphs into his final form at the end of the film. Knowing that every day Divoff had to play the fully formed Jinn and that it required 3 hours of makeup, I know these Hollywood stories are always like, oh, he had to go through 5 hours of makeup or 8 hours of makeup, but I think that at the end of the day, like, if you can see an actor's performance even through the makeup, no matter how minor, I think it's fascinating. I also read up, and actually, even though this took 3 hours to get on, it took 2 hours to get off, which I feel like a lot of documentaries don't talk about, the fact that, it took like 3 hours to get on, then you go on set, and then you shoot for like an hour or two, but the fact that it always takes time to get off is just, it's such a dedication. I know there's like hundreds of stories of this, but I absolutely love hearing about, like, having somebody just go through acting school, or like becoming a professional actor, and then just having to have the mindset of a Zen Buddhist while you get applied with just layers and layers of, oh god, just so much, just stuff that, I don't know, I feel weird about when like makeup or like anything that sticks to my face, it just feels super uncomfortable about.
Carmine.
Too much fucking shit on me.
What?
There's too much fucking shit on me. I can't breathe.
One thing I think that is fascinating, and I kind of imagine a modern character pulling this stuff off with practical effects, let alone CGI. Maybe, I don't know, Andy Serkis, or maybe like a really, really good horror auteur like Robert Eggers or Ari Aster or Lee Cronin could maybe have something like this. But I think the thing that I think is just amazing, especially from practical terms, are just the little things, like these demonic worms that are always near the Jinn's head. I had to watch this film like 4 or 5 times while doing this review, and obviously I had to edit it all together. But it just feels like there's something so fascinating about how they always move. They're always like they're just doing this little slimy puppetry. The only thing I can compare it to, the little guys that Doc Ock has in Spider-Man 2, like I like to imagine that he like stole them off of Medusa. Like the Jinn ripped this off of Medusa at some point, and he was like, well, I'm taking these are mine. And that's just, it's just so weird and gross, and I love it. And enough talk about Andrew Divoff. He's an amazing guy. He's an amazing actor. Let's think about the other actors, especially those who don't play the villain in this film. Wishmaster, from an acting perspective, is almost a beautiful banana sundae of horror fandom. I think it's so great to see the range of characters that this film has, and that the Jinn can bounce off and manipulate. And really, it's really just so fun to be like, oh, it's that guy. Oh, it's that guy. First and foremost, the narrator of the entire first movie is the one and only Angus Scrimm, the tall man from the Phantasm series, R.I.P.
Fire gave birth to the Jinn.
Another Phantasm alumni, Ice Cream Man Reggie, is in the film as a pharmacist who tells off amazing classic character actor George Flower. You may know him as Red from the Back to the Future movies. Again, R.I.P. George. Horror actor, effects master, and zombie destroyer Tom Savini is in the pharmacy sequence. He's just a random customer. He just happens to be there. Also, Vaughn Trier, again, R.I.P., is featured in the film in full makeup as one of the stages the Jinn goes through. You can see him in the documentary for like literally 1 second, like right here, and obviously a few more seconds in the film itself. He's such a trooper. Also in the same year that he did this, he did Men in Black. He's this alien here. Then there's Kane Hodder, aka Jason Voorhees. He's in the film as a bodyguard. We'll get to his death in a second. And then there's Candyman himself, Tony Todd, obviously an absolute legend, with one of the best names in the entire franchise, Johnny Valentine, who sounds like the coolest fucking R&B singer of the 1980s. Behind the scenes horror icon, writer, producer, and actor Ted Raimi, brother of Sam, obviously, is one of the first kills in the film, which is so funny, and also a great way to turn a kill into a plot point as well. I love that there's no real discussion about his death except at the end of the film, which I'm not going to spoil yet, but goddamn, I just love this. Also, there is the absolute legend, Robert Englund. Freddy Krueger himself plays Raymond Beaumont, the rich asshole who literally starts off the entire film as the importer of the statue that holds the fire opal, that holds the Jinn. Oh, and also Kurtzman has a cameo in the film. He's this guy who gets sliced up by piano wire at the end of the film. A cameo apparently he said he really loved doing, and talked about how fun it was to have him die in the film that he was directing, which I think is great. I imagine that's probably a fun thing to do if you're a director. According to an interview with Kurtzman from 2007, Wishmaster cost about $6 million US and was shot in just 33 days. Again, it was a tight budget, it was a tight schedule, especially for a horror film at that time. So with just over a month to shoot in Los Angeles and a distribution deal with Live Entertainment, no, I've never heard of them either. Oh, they became Artisan Entertainment. Oh, okay, and they became Lionsgate Entertainment. Well, I guess good for them. Wishmaster was set after a 33-day shoot for its big horror debut on September 19th, 1997. Now, with all of that history and lore out of the way, as folks like to call it, is Wishmaster any good? And also, what is it about? I feel like I haven't really gone into it other than the base premise of, hey, it's a genie and he does evil things and he's just trying to get some souls. I think it's now a good time to answer that question. I will say my initial opinion of Wishmaster when I saw it at about 12 or 13 years old was that it was a fascinatingly camp but terrifying film. As an adult in his early 30s now, I think Wishmaster as a film is very good considering the era it came out in. As I mentioned before, Wishmaster was released at the beginning of what was becoming a new horror renaissance. Horror had not only become extremely profitable, but smart and trying to go ahead of other genres. I think one of the main flaws, especially in the period it came out with, was that it didn't have a meta-modernist approach to horror. Wishmaster as a movie is classic in so many different ways, as it is core to a similar structure with sketch films or classic satires and comedies, like Flying High or Airplane if you're American, or Pop Star Never Stop, Never Stopping.
I love the road, this is kind of a perfect job for me, but my favorite free time thing is flatlining.
Heart rate dropping.
Flatlining is when you technically lower your heart rate until, well, you're dead.
You simply have a premise where you're ultimately hanging gags or visual effects off scenes. In this case, the gag is, okay, what fucked up wish are we going to unleash on our audience? The plot, as I kind of insinuated, is relatively thin. You have this character, Alex, an appraiser at an auction house owned by this guy, Nick Merritt. Both Alex and Nick don't have a lot going on as both people and as characters. The start of the film begins with a preamble, which I'll get to in a sec, but essentially a dock worker steals a gem from a drunken accident that crushes poor Ted Raimi, which, look, there's a lot of OSHA issues happening here for a multitude of reasons. Let's not get into that right now. Alex is also in a situationship with this guy. This guy's Josh. I kind of don't know where they find themselves. It's kind of a friend zone thing, if you believe in that stuff, but anyway, they don't really know what to do with themselves. I have already forgotten that this film is about a magic evil genie. So let's go right back to the start. Okay, so there's a genie. He's in this gem. He was put there by a sorcerer in the 12th century where a lot of fucked up stuff happened. Then in the modern day, once Alex gets her hands on the gem that the dock worker stole, she rubs it, and then the rules are kind of set up for the movie and the franchise as a whole, that if you release the gem, you get 3 wishes, but once you do those wishes, which is also powered by souls, then Jinn takes over the world. Now, this is something I'll get into more later on about the fact that the worst part of the franchise is that the rules for the Jinn don't really make sense, and they're constantly changing. It's super clear in most horror films, especially with some sort of mystical or fantastical element, that the rules are set in place and are usually quite easy to follow. But for this franchise, it's just not that clear how many souls he needs, whether or not the 3 wishes factors into it. It actually genuinely changes from movie to movie, and not because, like, oh, we're evolving the formula. It's just confusing. But if you forget about that, honestly, it's just a great time, and the more wishes there are, the more chaos ensues. Before we get into all of that, I have to talk about 2 things that I genuinely don't love about the film other than the rules, which is the acting and the dialogue. I think Peter Atkins did a fantastic job, and our main cast, including Andrew Divoff, did a pretty good job. Our director isn't the most adept when it comes to acting. I think first and foremost, Tammy Lauren is an underrated scream queen. She does a pretty good job, and she's kind of badass in a few scenes when she goes up against the Wishmaster itself. I've been this horrified by somebody screaming Josh since Heather did it in the Blair Witch Project. Josh! I also have to say that I truly love all of the random side characters and bit part actors or character actors that you get to see in here. So George Flower, as the homeless man, who you may know, like I mentioned before, from Back to the Future, he encounters the Jinn in an alleyway, and I just love how this looks. Like, it honestly feels Lynchian. Like, it feels like the scene at the start of Mulholland Drive. Like, I really, really love it. Also, Robert Englund is fantastic as the art collector Richard Beaumont, who's kind of the linchpin for this entire story. He's an obsessive who is just odd and creepy. Even without regular makeup, he's just such a consummate actor. I really just love him, even when he's not Freddy Krueger. There's also Chris Lemmon, who is great as Nick Merritt. Like, even though Nick and Alex and Josh kind of don't have any more than 2 dimensions, I just think he's the right amount of sliminess that just doesn't go overboard. Like, he's not super creepy with Alex, he's just kind of a little bit off. As Alex's boss and the owner of Regal Auctioneers, obviously he's very, very greedy and he's a little bit uncomfortable, but I just love the fact that he does play this character in a comedic sense. Also, if you recognize Chris Lemmon, and especially his name, Chris Lemmon, yes, he is literally Jack Lemmon's son, the obviously very, very famous actor of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But also he played his dad. Chris Lemmon played Jack Lemmon in that Marilyn Monroe biopic that people didn't like, Blonde, which I thought was fine. Finally, when it comes to acting, Andrew Divoff. Divoff's voice is barely processed in this movie. He has such a lilt to it when he is like saying certain things that could come off as like over the top or ridiculous, but he makes it work so well, and with and without the makeup, he's fucking incredible just as an evil character. Whether or not you think he's believable as a Jinn, whatever.
But tell them quickly, while you still have a soul.
Divoff is just so good at making him purely evil no matter what he's saying. He could literally be saying, "Your dog looks adorable," and I'd be terrified that he would just crush my little guy with his bare hands and then turn him into some sort of gory balloon animal. I think the film shines when it just focuses on the horror and the effects and the djinn just being an evil fuck. You don't know what's going to happen next. I implore you to watch this movie without watching anything. I think it's a real waste if you're watching this video essay and you kind of have an inkling of this film. I really highly suggest you just stop and just go and watch it. I genuinely cannot stress this enough. Even if you have it on like while you're at a party or just hanging out with friends and talking over it, you won't miss a thing if you just shut the fuck up during when someone says, "Oh, I wish."
Wish. Wishes. Wishes.
Whenever Divoff is on screen, just divert your gaze immediately towards the screen. The movie is uncomfortable and gross and evil for a multitude of reasons. I do think that a lot of it obviously is the effects, but the color grading and especially the score of the film is so deeply nihilistic and just is intentionally just trying to make you uncomfortable that your desires and needs, while important, yes, the way that they are executed is just fucking awful. And like Divoff, it just oozes off the screen and is just there to make you feel like your worst and base desires could come to life and kill you. I also have to say that some of the best wishes in the whole franchise happen in this movie, and it's a stellar example of Kurtzman and Atkins and the entire effects team just acting together as just a solid unit. One of the best deaths / wishes in this film, this franchise, is just the djinn blowing his fucking head off. And frankly, I'm sorry I had to blur it and censor it here because I just didn't want to get this video demonetized for a multitude of reasons. But I love that it's clearly a wish that even in the 90s, some nitpicking horror fanboy would have 100% put in some alt.net or some shitty forum back in the day, and they would have just been like, look, it's like, if I had a djinn, if I had a wish, I would just like ask him to just blow his brains out because like, what else is he gonna do? And he does it, and it looks gory and dark as fuck, and I really just like it. I just think it's really, really well done.
Fuck you!
One thing I can definitely say about the film is that their lighting and camera department and effects team, like whoever was just handling the lighting for this film, is just wonderful. There is a match cut right here that I'm showing on screen now. That honestly has more artistry and caretaking in it than most Blumhouse films. Speaking of which, there is a film that truly earns its jump scare moment, like right here.
Going my way.
I just love that. I just really, really love that. And also the villain just being fucking evil is for no fucking reason. I feel like we just don't have that in horror films anymore. I really do think that there's like, yes, there's tormenting the protagonist, and you could kind of talk about like Insidious or the Conjuring films where there's like, well, it's an evil presence and it's kind of doing this thing and that thing to fuck with them. But in here, it's just having this back and forth. I just feel like we don't really have that with villains anymore. And I miss that. I miss that, like, that almost like Monkey Island-esque kind of wordplay and back jumping off. And I think obviously largely it is Atkins' script, and Divoff is just amazing. He really knows how to take a scene and just amp it up to 11. I really just miss villains that were just pure fucking evil and that we didn't have to exist so we could sell toys and other promotional shit or sequels. It just, I think I liked villains just being fucked up for no reason other than the sake that they're fucked up. Not like we have to have like a really sad backstory to them. And finally, look, I think that while I haven't covered it much, I have obviously shown clips of it. The piece de resistance for Kurtzman and everybody in this film, except maybe the actors, is the last 10 minutes of the film. I do love the fact that we get a total of 17 wishes in this film. Yes, I count them. And honestly, the last wish in the museum is just amazing. It literally just runs the entire gamut of this last fraction of the film, and it's just amazing. Watching the entire sequence of the museum is really like, oh, okay, like, you know, we had our fun, maybe let's just wrap it up. And then it just cranks it up to being like, oh fuck, we're really gonna do this. It is so rare to get this experience in horror anymore, let alone in a film from the 90s. My go-to example of this, and it's honestly one that I've loved for over a decade at this point, is Cabin in the Woods. If you've seen Cabin in the Woods, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Here's literally one clip from it that I can probably legally show.
Oh, shit.
I just love seeing it for its weird and gory and strange glory. It is just fantastic, and I really miss a lot of films that have these kind of practical and cool weird effects. I just really feel like I don't know what it is, especially with this final sequence, but it really does rival a lot of great horror films that really just don't give you a great finale anymore. I don't know what it is about. Like, I watched Smile 2 recently, and I thought the ending to that was just absolutely abysmal. I thought the whole film was terrible, but I do think that like something, even just something simple like a dude just catching fire and just coming at you is terrifying. And I think honestly I blame playing Resident Evil 4 when I was like 15 that's truly never left me. Like this section here, it's awful. I hate it. I hate that it's in every single Resident Evil 4 remake since, and I wish they would take it out. I don't actually wish that. Either way, the last few minutes of the film are fantastic, and in fact, while I don't personally love the sequence compared to other big moments in the series, and then basically, look, when it comes to the plot, in the end, Alex undoes the spell by just being smart, which I also really liked, and putting the pieces of this, I would say, relatively simple puzzle box together. If you're kind of paying attention, you could probably figure out the ending of the film probably about an hour in. Essentially, she just wishes that this guy wasn't drunk, and I kind of like that. It's like, wow, she kind of cured his alcoholism. It's something that you could, I mean, I don't know that that's what exactly happens, but I just like the fact that the audience could really put it together, and then it kind of helps also with what Alex was doing in her investigation. It's just a neat bow to end the film on, and then I will say, despite the fact that I think the film is very fun and very fantastic, the last 2 to 3 minutes of the film are kind of the weirdest parts of the film. It also raises a lot of questions about time travel and like what Alex's meddling actually does. Like, did she just kind of delete the timeline in like a kind of Marvel way, or is it like there's general implications of like paradoxes like in the Butterfly Effect or even like Back to the Future Part 2? It's just never really explained, and I think that that's fine. Like, but I just want to know, like, does she forget everything that happened, or is she just kind of put into a timeline and then she has like this knowledge, which is I guess why she gets with Josh in the end. Anyway, the movie ending feels like a studio note thing where they're like, can we kind of end it on like a happy note? But it's honestly the weakest part of the film. I think it's so stupid, and then it's kind of like leads up to like some sequel bait bullshit, which I always really hate. And then Motorhead plays, which I obviously can't play here without getting a copyright strike, so I unfortunately just have to enjoy the white on black credits. The song's called Listen to Your Heart, which is kind of funny because it's from an album called Overnight Sensation, and there's a song on there called Eat the Gun, and I feel like that would have been a better choice because, you know, remember this scene. Kurtzman is a great director, and I think he's doing so much with so very little. Like, again, the budget was very, very small considering what was going into horror films at that time. The grading is so dark and red constantly, like it kind of looks like you're inside a red gem from Crash Bandicoot 2. Like, the whole movie, it does give you this like tense, like uncomfortable nature, like that, especially in terms of the framing and the shots. Like, it makes you really feel claustrophobic, especially when the Djinn is there. They always have like a close-up on him, which honestly I think it just highlights the amazing work from the makeup team. I think Atkin's script, while not great at times, it is tight, it is fun, it is weird, it's also oddly clever in some places, especially the ending, I just think really, really well written. And I think honestly it comes from the history of the Hellraiser series, which also has a literal puzzle box element. I think he honestly saved some of the best and most torturous moments for this film. It really shows that given the only other horror film that he's written since 1997 is a film called Prisoners of the Sun, which is mainly focused about Gimli fighting mummies. I looked up like the trailer for it, there's like barely any gore or torture in sight, so maybe he kind of like shot his wad on this one and was just like, I'm done with torture films and anyway, that's my opinion. At the end of the day, I just have to ask the question, would you watch Wishmaster again, and is it any good? Is it any good? Yes! I think for a B movie, it's fantastic. I think if you're looking for a horror film that is solely about the creative, gory, and horrific kills, you couldn't do much better in 1997. The only thing that comes remotely close is another puzzle box, Cube, which I think is amazing and a masterpiece of independent filmmaking, and especially horror filmmaking, and obviously the Lovecraftian Event Horizon, which didn't do so well at the box office at the exact same time. Look, everyone here did an amazing job, and while I know the film isn't perfect, and I think there was so much happening in horror, especially in the late 90s, that for what it's worth, Wishmaster is underrated in every single aspect. That it doesn't feel like a 90s horror film in any visual realm. I feel like it would have served better as a late 80s, maybe early 90s body horror release, because that was really, really going well at that time, especially with John Carpenter and David Cronenberg. But especially considering magical horror post Elm Street wasn't like a huge thing except for the Leprechaun films. I feel like we kind of don't have a lot of that anymore. Even the Blumhouse production factory, they don't have a lot of magical horror film, unless you want to count Imaginary, which I wouldn't. Looking back at the horror of the time, I always was a fan of Freddy over Jason. When I started watching horror films in my teens, I just felt like Freddy was just more creative and just was a better character because the kills were just more integrated naturally into the plot and the characters and the personality. And while I still think out of all of the Friday the 13th films, the best is Jason X, it's for the same reason. It's pure creative and ridiculous kills. Wishmaster has that in spades. Whether or not you think it's a good movie, look, again, we'll talk about the Letterboxd rating down the track, but I couldn't really tell you other than the fact that I really like this film. I think it's very and memorable. I think the filmmaking is slick, slimy, and fascinating to look at. I think there's a few flaws here and there, but I think at the end of the day, Wishmaster does what it says on the tin. It's a gripping B-horror film that focuses more on its kills and creativity than its plot and characters. And yes, it does let it down in some areas, but ultimately, I think that the focus on the Djinn as the protagonist, essentially, because it's his backstory and his journey, and the film begins and ends with him, I think if you kind of look at it that way, it's fantastic. And obviously, it is largely pushed up by Divoff's performance, which is one weird trade-off, I guess, in the fact that there is one negative thing about the Djinn is that his powers are so freaking broad. Like, I think that there's like really only 2 examples of stuff that he can't do, but then again, he's the one explaining it. And I guess that's okay, given that we're never meant to know the extent of the creature's powers, because he's a Djinn. He's granting wishes at the end of the day. Like, there's stuff where he could just light shit on fire, like that's not a wish. And like, also, you never really see how he like gets access to things, unless it's a kill, obviously. And while I did cover it prior, I do think that Wishmaster is good on a technical level. And I think that ultimately, what would have done it better would have been, I don't know, maybe it was released at a different time, which is why I need now to talk about the reception, the box office, and the legacy of the first Wishmaster film. So Wishmaster was finally unleashed to the general public on September 19th, 1997. And it did okay. And when I say okay, I mean like, yeah, okay. It's literally the 99th highest grossing film of 1997. And it just came after the Leslie Nielsen vehicle, Mr. Magoo, and just another movie where Steven Seagal plays a guy who works for the EPA. That's a whole other conversation I don't want to get into. Like I mentioned before, the film had a domestic taking of over 15 million. In fact, its first weekend got all of its money back, and while it was released in September against the likes of David Fincher's The Game, Curtis Hanson's LA Confidential, and the aforementioned film where, again, Steven Seagal plays an EPA agent, the film came in third at the box office for that week. Luckily, despite Halloween being just a month away, the film had no real horror competition excluding the previously mentioned Event Horizon in its 15th week, Guillermo del Toro's Mimic in its 11th week, and the movie adaptation Leave It to Beaver, which, as we all know, is horrific. The film eventually fell out of the top 10 by week 3, but did get a boost when Halloween rolled around and had to contend with I Know What You Did Last Summer and The Devil's Advocate, but by the end of its run, it had hit a $50 million box office on a $6 million budget. So even with marketing taken into account, which back then would have been 1 to 1.5 times the original budget, the film broke even. And you'd think a sequel would be just as successful and go right into production, and you would technically be right. The film broke even at the box office, and it did incredibly well on VHS and DVD. In fact, it's the only film in the series where we'll actually talk about the box office because, well, you'll see why that is the case. One thing I thought was really, really fascinating to read and look through was the original script, which is available on the Internet Archive, which I highly recommend you look up. There were a few tiny things. I don't think it's worth mentioning here, but I wanted to at least kind of focus on the fact that I did include this in my research. There's minor name changes like Raymond Beaumont actually being originally called Anthony, which is one thing. Descriptions of certain deaths are obviously a little bit different, but I also highly recommend, if you're a fan of this series, just picking up Vestron's release of Wishmaster, which was incredibly helpful just putting this video essay together. The commentaries alone from Kurtzman, Atkins, and actors Tammy Lauren and Andrew Divoff was worth the price of the Blu-ray alone. Like, hearing the back and forth between Kurtzman and Atkins, like, you would really hope that they would have worked together. Like, kind of just sounds like they're old friends. I will say, from a critic's perspective, obviously critics hated this film, and while I will be going in depth on the sequels, I will say there are a lot of people who just genuinely love this film and its series. It's honestly been great seeing other YouTubers talk about this film, and especially Letterboxd was pretty comfortable with talking about how, yes, it's 90s nostalgia, but the creativity and how fun this film is. Even it's great to see like people like Sarah Sherman, who's my favorite current SNL cast member. She's a big fan of the film. She gave it a bunch of stars. Oh, Sarah Sherman, why can't you be mine? Also, I think it's 100% crazy that you could just watch this for free in 1080p on YouTube, which I would not suggest, but it is available. But I got the physical release because pretty sick. I like having physical copies of these great films. Honestly, as this first chapter comes to a close, I'll let Kurtzman himself talk about his goals for the film and when he hoped to succeed when he made something like Wishmaster.
And that was my goal, just to pack as much as I could onto the screen, make a fun ride, and I like to go to horror films and just sit there and have a good time, be scared, have a few laughs, see some, of course, gore effects, because a horror movie needs it. And, I'm very happy with the way it turned out.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you did it. You made a film that's exactly that, man. You should be proud. You should be proud of everyone who worked on this film should be proud, frankly. So anyway, after 1997 closed its doors, there was an announcement for the sequel to Wishmaster called Wishmaster 2. Let's get into it. Okay, here we go. So I want to preface before I talk about the remaining Wishmaster films, there's so little to go off in terms of research compared to the first film that if you're one of the 11 people that saw my Deep Blue Sea review, you know I love going deep on these franchises, but god damn, there is so little to go off with these sequels, but let's get into it. I just wanted to preface that it's not going to be as deep as the first part. Now, I had to look through a lot of stuff when it came to Wishmaster 2 and its development, but according to a 2023 interview with the entertainment site Cryptic Rock, when Kurtzman was asked if he was going to be a part of the sequels, Kurtzman replied that he didn't want to be a part of the sequels as the studios, and I quote, wanted the same but at a lower budget. Andrew Divoff agreed to take on the Jin character again, and if the budget was big enough, I would definitely consider directing another Wishmaster. Now, again, I don't have a lot of notes on the production or behind the scenes of Wishmaster 2, but I will say that one of my favorite stories, which look, I read it on IMDb, which is sometimes not true, but the director and writer of Wishmaster 2, Evil Never Dies, that's the subtitle for it, is a man by the name of Jack Shoulder. Now, Jack was asked to direct this film, but declined as he said the script wasn't good enough. When it came to the sequel, he was asked again to direct, but he turned it down again until the producers told him he could write the entire script from scratch for the sequel. For those unaware, Shoulder was a big horror director back in the 1980s. He's mainly known for the first sequel to the Elm Street series, Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge, which I think is actually a pretty good horror film. With only half the budget and knowing the film was going to probably be a direct-to-video or direct-to-DVD sequel, one thing I will say from the get-go is that this film is ridiculous. It's not great. I would never say Wishmaster 2, Evil Never Dies, is great. But what is Wishmaster 2 even about? Wishmaster 2 is fucking batshit insane, and I fucking love it. It definitely looks a little bit cheaper than the first. It's not too bad, but what it lacks in budget, it makes up for in just being as ridiculous and as gross as it can possibly get. Much like the first film, the plot largely revolves around just a person who finds the Jinn, and then obviously havoc gets wreaked. The Jinn is in a statue breaks, Jinn gem gets freed, the Jinn gets freed, and then basically he has to try to annihilate 1,001 souls to take over the earth. This is like what I was saying in the first part about the fact that the rules are so weird and so different for each film that I think it's quite interesting if they were to reboot it, which one they would actually use. But before I get to that, Andrew Divoff, who absolutely killed it in the first film as Nathaniel Dearest, aka the Jinn in human form, but I think in Wishmaster 2, he truly perfects it. The character, the voice, everything. I will say that while there isn't a lot to say about the directing, I think it's fine in most places. But Jack Shoulder, just to put the facts out there, he may not have directed a project in 20 years. Like looking at something like Wishmaster 2, that actually seems like a calling card for a writer-director who is basically taking the structure and form of an original film and then just cranking it up to 11 and just trying to be basically what horror needed at the time. But look, I'm not going to summarize the whole film or like how I feel about it yet, mainly because like there's plenty of other YouTubers who do that and I don't like doing that. There's also Wikipedia, you can check that out, but obviously I'll talk about kind of the plot, I guess, overall. The film is meant to be about Morgana, who is a small-time thief who confides in her former partner turned priest that her life is turned upside down by the titular Wishmaster. Morgana tries to figure out how to defeat this ancient evil, but then he just gets sent to prison and becomes the head of a Russian gang, and then I can't even begin to explain what happens in the start of the third act, but eventually he goes to a casino and just it just gets crazier from there. You know, typical Wishmaster stuff. The thing I love and hate about this film is that relative to the first film, it's pretty good. It's not great. I think the first film is great, but I think it plays the rules so fast and loose that it's hard to take it seriously, and I don't think the film wants to take itself seriously. I think Jack Shoulder took what it was relatively a simple and straightforward premise and just really thought, okay, what is the dumbest, grossest, silliest way I can take this premise and just shove it in the audience faces? And I think it works. I think it really works because it doesn't take itself too seriously, and I think that it knows it's not taking itself too seriously. I think the best horror, like the best comedies, like I said before, are really vehicles to just put the most gruesome and creative ways to rack up their kill count before the credits roll. And Wishmaster 2 has it in spades and then some. Well, I don't think the kill count is higher. I'd have to check some numbers on that, and here they are on screen. The structure of the films are relatively simple. You get the Jinn, you release the Jinn does some big set pieces or just like kills like one or two people. Jinn goes for a big climax, the protagonist outsmarts the Jinn, and then everything goes back to normal. That's all you really need for a Wishmaster film, and it doesn't need to be that complicated. I think that Wishmaster Wishmaster 2, in its simplicity, is so wonderful to rely purely on the fact that the djinn is the main character, like what I basically said in the first film. The ending of Wishmaster 2 is unfortunately not that creative. The opening and closing of the film is where I think that things kind of get let down, but I think that with the djinn being his own undoing, I guess with the wishes, by Morgana just basically undoing a small fraction of what happened at the start, which is basically the exact same thing in the first film. I do like the fact that they use their wit to outsmart the djinn, because the djinn is evil, but he's also creative. I think it's just so funny that that's how he gets put back into his gem. And I think it's just so weird that both of the movies kind of end with basically the exact same thing happening. Like, if you don't want to know how the film ends, you just kind of have to have a relatively short attention span. I think a modern film would set up a sequel or like have a jump scare in the end sequence, you know, like The Conjuring or Insidious or those kind of films. But I think the Wishmaster films, one thing I like is that while there is a little bit of sequel baiting, the films just end. Like, this is what the last scene looks like in Wishmaster 2. Like, that's it. I mean, but it does beg the question, obviously, which I've avoided so far, is Wishmaster 2 any good? I want to state from the get-go that ever since I was a teenager, whenever a film trailer would talk about a director or a writer or the producers of, I was always very, very skeptical until in my 20s when I started going to university for film. And I always feel like there are certain creatives or there are certain people that are necessary, especially for a sequel or a new franchise being set up, that those people are either brought back or at least brought in to help some of the creative choices. With Wishmaster 2, without Peter Atkins' structure and Kurtzman's creativity and direction, I think the film ultimately falters just in a few areas. I think it's largely due to budget constraints more than anything else, and I think that some of the acting just isn't there except for Divoff and honestly some of the amazing bit and character actors that are in the prison sequences. I think one of the worst parts of the film, and I understand why it's in there, but I really don't like the shoddy telling of the exposition or just the general story or the lore of the djinn. I think it's so weird to have these rules that, again, aren't explicitly stated in the first film, but are changed so drastically to essentially amp up the body count, but then it doesn't really happen. Obviously, there is the casino sequence, which I mentioned previously, where the numbers kind of go from dozens to hundreds. But even then, like, looking at these crowd sequences, I don't think you could count more than maybe 100 to 200 people here. I think it's so funny how just the numbers don't add up for the djinn and the souls that he needs to take in a casino. If it was a real casino, which again, looking at this, it's very much a set or a place that they hired and then made to look like a casino. If they just said 100 souls, I think that would be easier, or like 500 or 800. Where did they get 1,001 souls from? Like, I get that it's an allusion to the classic Arabic tale, the 1,001 Nights, like that kind of anthology story kind of situation. I feel like other than they're being connected to the djinn and the Middle Eastern storytelling, which, look, I'm not going to say that they whitewashed the djinn because Andrew Divoff is in there. I'm not going to say that. I don't think it was a second thought to anybody working on these films at the time. But I just feel like there is so little to really let the audience kind of in on how this film works. That being said, I do have to praise Shoulder for working on a much more limited budget, and honestly, the creativity, the gags in this, the most famous joke, I guess, or a kill in this film is the "go fuck yourself" gag.
I believe you said you'd like to see your lawyer go fuck himself.
And I think the creativity to take it to a level that is both violent and horrifying, but still kind of funny, I think it's great. It very much is reminiscent of Craven's work with the original Nightmare on Elm Street, where the focus is truly on how weird and wonderful can we make this until the audience starts to break. I think that for a sequel, it packs so many extra punches in terms of the wishes and the cruel fates that Shoulder dishes out that I have to give him credit on that alone. I don't think that there is anything even remotely close to as sinister and horrible as some of the stuff that goes down in Wishmaster 2 that's in Wishmaster 1. Also, I will say that The one thing that I do enjoy about the writing is this weird religious subplot, this general undertone of like holiness about the film. I literally gasped the first time I saw Greg getting crucified at the end of the film because I was like, I just didn't expect that. I don't think I've ever seen a film where a priest or a pastor gets crucified, except I think maybe one of the Hellraisers has that. I guess the Djinn is technically a demon of some kind, and that really works for his character and also like the visual references that we're seeing in the church and kind of like, I mean, look, frankly, it's more window dressing more than anything else, but they make it gory and they make it terrifying to look at. Now, the main thing I want to focus on with this film is that there's just over a dozen wishes in this film. It's about the same as the first movie, but I do think when I think of the Wishmaster series, except for maybe one or two wishes that I would always see in the trailer in the first Wishmaster, I think genuinely, and this might be a hot take alert, I think the wishes in Wishmaster 2 are more memorable and just straight up weird. I think three of the most memorable wishes, the unborn wish, the go fuck yourself wish, and the coin lady, is so disturbingly absurd and disgustingly fascinating that it almost feels like there is no other time in cinema history that these gags could have been put in a horror film. I think the second and third wishes that I mentioned there, Coin Lady and Fuck Yourself, I literally cannot compare them to any other movie. Like any other horror film, any other Wishmaster movie, any Nightmare on Elm Street. I feel like they got these jokes from like an unseen, uncensored version of an episode of Drawn Together. Like, I get it. I get the joke and I get it's kind of funny, but how it's represented, even down to the sound design with the Coin Lady, is just horrifyingly unnecessary. But it's great. I can't get it out of my head. I can't stop thinking about where the coins are coming from. It's really well done. I'm sorry to focus on this so much. I think acting wise, Andrew Divoff is given so much time to shine in this film, especially compared to the first one. I genuinely love him. I think he's a great character actor. I think he's so underutilized from modern directors. I think this could possibly be his best performance ever. I don't know how he feels about that. I did reach out to his website and obviously I got nothing back because I think they probably wanted me to pay for it. But the guy is so wonderfully unhinged and creepy in these moments that you kind of get a sense that in the first film, it's almost like he's just the general adversary to everybody in the film. But when you put him in the prison system, to put him up against guys, especially with Divoff's look, frame, demeanor, etc., it almost feels like you think he's going to be underplayed by all of these toughs, essentially. And I feel like the way that the Wishmaster learns about the prison system is so funny.
Exactly which drugs would you like? I don't give a damn.
Only thing I can truly compare it to, and I will bring it up later on, is Psycho Goreman. Somebody who is so absurdly magical and mystical and then brought into such a serious, almost, I wouldn't say it's very much like the TV show Oz, but almost bringing it to the structure of the prison system where he knows that bartering for souls isn't going to cut it. This scene here, where he is essentially cut out of a deal because he can't barter without cigarettes, is so funny and so wonderfully done.
What's it gonna take?
Your soul. And a pack of cigarettes.
But he learns from it. Like, it's one of the few things where I can only think of, like, a comparison is the film Species, when the girl is trying to learn how the world works and stuff like that. And I feel like, yeah, it's very similar to what the Wishmaster is doing here in prison. He has to take real world rules and then apply it to his own real stupid rules. The line delivery for this scene is perfect. Plus, he gets to say the subtitle of the movie during the film, which is always a wonderful choice.
Evil never dies.
He's just too funny as the Djinn, and I think it's an intentional choice as an actor. While I don't think the first film is truly campy, I do think that there is something about the Wishmaster, or rather the Djinn, that is over the top, that he is like some sort of demonic prankster. The amount of times he has an almost Joker-esque affection and facial expression is really, really fun and fascinating. He is this prankster demon who is just a real joy to watch. You kind of can't not root for him because you kind of want to see what he does next. He is the heart and soul of this franchise. And I would say that if you were going to make a sequel or other entries in the series, I wouldn't replace him. I think he's wonderful and worth every single dollar on screen. That's a bit of foreshadowing. That's some foreshadowing. I will put it in there. Like I mentioned before, I obviously read IMDb trivia and try to pick out the ones that I think are very, very true. Apparently, also one thing in the film, and I did check through most of it, is that Divoff, when he's in this character of Nathaniel Dearest, he never blinks when he's on screen. And frankly, I genuinely don't think that's the case. I think that that's a really odd and wonderful choice for an actor to make. I didn't really check the first film, but like skimming through it, that looks like he doesn't blink. I think it's an insane choice for an actor, but I like the idea of like the djinn is so not used to having a human body or like human bodily functions that he genuinely just wouldn't know not to blink.
Yo, man, are you tripping? Who the fuck are you?
I think the longest I can go without blinking is like maybe 30 to 40 seconds, but like sometimes Divoff just smiling like a fucking idiot in these scenes and just listening to the characters interact. And he also very rarely moves his body to see who's talking. He is so straight-laced and almost like locked down in the scene. I think it's amazing. I think I think it's wonderful to see him do so much with this character with such subtle movements. That being said, for the secondary cast, we lose a lot of the great horror actors from the first movie who I feel like we're doing a lot of favors for both Wes Craven and Kurtzman. But the remainder of the cast for Wishmaster 2 is relatively okay. Our protagonist, Holly Fields, is okay as Morgana. Looking her up afterwards, her strong suit is actually voice acting. If you look through her IMDb, she's been a huge part of the Star Wars universe, and she's also Princess Fiona in the Shrek games. Like, I didn't know that Cameron Diaz didn't. I've played a lot of those games. I even did like a Shrektober thing when I used to be a streamer. Didn't know that was not Cameron Diaz.
Oh, Shrek! They're holding a Founders Day carnival in far, far away.
I think if I had seen this movie in my teens, I'm gonna just be honest here, I really do think that I would have been obsessed with this movie and Holly Fields because she just has this goth light look, and I can't not think about how much a teen version of me would have been just like thinking how hot she is, especially in these weird sleeping scenes, which I think is so gratuitous. Obviously, I have to censor some of this because I think this video is gonna get flagged regardless, but like I get it. It's a horror movie in the late 90s and early 2000s, but like even I think this is like a little too much, man. Speaking of actors, I think another real highlight is seeing fantastic character actor Tommy Lister. He's a former pro wrestler turned actor back in the 90s, and I think people would largely remember him from The Fifth Element, The Dark Knight. He's in the Friday movies, which I also really love. Here he is playing a prison guard, and it's a relatively small role, but I think it's just awesome. Also, I couldn't really confirm this, but apparently it's true on IMDb that Corey Haim is the other burglar in the start of the film, which I also thought was pretty cool. Unfortunately, the rest of the cast is largely forgettable, except for Paul Johansson, who plays the priest Gregory. I think he does a pretty good job. It is pretty like two-dimensional, but it's not really his fault. It's largely the script's fault. I do think she does have chemistry with Holly Fields, and I do think he's quite attractive in a hot priest kind of way. I do think that obviously he clearly is very attractive to a lot of people because he was on One Tree Hill for 9 years, so you know, good for him.
Dr. Casper. Nurse Henderson to admitting. Nurse Henderson to admitting.
Overall, Wishmaster 2 is frankly a step forward in the right direction, but it does sidestep a little bit into the ridiculous territory. I think it pushes the limits of what the Wishmaster franchise can do creatively, but it's a drop in terms of budget, acting, and special effects. The writing and directing isn't the best, but I do think Shoulder did the best with what he had. I think it shows that you need a lot of heart, great effects, and a killer djinn to make a Wishmaster truly what it is. It has to be gory and over the top, sure, but if you don't have a good strong backbone for your script, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get across the line.
In God's name, I command you out of this world. I wish you into hell, Demarest.
Gotcha.
Now, in regards to the film itself and its release, it's actually hard to gauge what the reaction was for these films beside a few reviews and some IMDb comments, which I pulled up here. It's rather negative overall, obviously from a critic's perspective, but I think modern audiences looking back on it, especially horror fans, have looked relatively favorable to this film, especially ranking it almost as high as the first film. Even looking at Letterboxd, the difference between the first and the second film is literally half a star. Like, not even a full star, just half a star. And frankly, I haven't watched this a couple times, and obviously editing it right now to put this together, I think that's 100% fair. Yes, it's a lesser sequel, but it does try really hard and keep its roots and creativity as high as possible. That being said, Divoff has spoken highly of this film. Shoulder even spoke about the film in a horror doco called Behind the Curtain Part 2 back in 2012, specifically stating that he had mixed feelings about the film and mentioned that some parts of the film are a little dumb, which, hey, Jack, I totally understand that and agree with you. Shoulder said about the filmmaking process, when I was making it, I thought it was good. I thought a lot of it could be kind of funny or clever. I definitely feel it has merit. From what I can gather, it's one of those films that divides people. Some people don't like it, others do. And it was also a sequel that I thought wasn't a good movie at all. Shoulder later praised the casino sequence in the film as pretty good, but said maybe it comes off as a bit silly. And while I partially agree with Shoulder, obviously, I think ultimately he was fighting an uphill battle from the beginning and wanted creative control, which he got to some degree. Sequels are hard. Sequels with lower budgets are even harder. But I still think Shoulder made it work in certain areas. Once the film came out on DVD and VHS, one has to ask, what happens next? So while I'm not going to talk about the legacy of the DVD and VHS sales, because frankly, I couldn't find heaps about it, I will say it's fascinating to read about how the film was originally going to have a theatrical release, like just putting it straight out in the cinemas, and then they just scrapped the whole idea and released it to HBO TV as a premiere. It was straight to video pretty much everywhere else around the world. I always thought it was weird that in Australia, I didn't know there was even a sequel until I saw a review on like Arrow in the Head or something like that back in the early 2000s, because my local video store had a copy of Wishmaster 2. It was only on DVD, but literally it had an almost identical cover to the first Wishmaster. In fact, I looked it up and it literally looks like this. If you weren't looking closely enough and you just saw this creepy face in black and red and you think Evil Never Dies is just the tagline, but it's actually the film Wishmaster 2, Evil Never Dies, then you could easily be confused. What's even funnier now is that because the films aren't really available on any streaming services, at least none that I could find locally, the DVD and VHS versions, both here and internationally, for those first two Wishmaster films, they're incredibly coveted items. And I've even seen copies of it go for like 20 to 30 bucks each, which I think is crazy unless you're a big horror fan. I ended up finding this 2-pack here for like 55 bucks, but like neither of them had any special features. So obviously I didn't bother to get them. I try not to buy DVDs now anyway, unless they're obviously quite rare. Like I mentioned before, I did spend 40 bucks on this international Blu-ray release. Honestly, it's a great tax write-off, but unfortunately, I did not do that for Wishmaster 2. Looking at this sequel and all that it has become, I can only think it's fair to say that Wishmaster 2, if it was released theatrically, it would have likely bombed. In the early 2000s, especially in 1999, horror had taken a bit of a turn. Looking at the release date of this second film, it would have probably been released in at least late March or early April. The film would have likely bombed since March is usually not too kind to horror in general, unless I guess you're a Blumhouse film. Wishmaster 2 would have been pushed up against the likes of Analyze This, Cruel Intentions, 10 Things I Hate About You, and a little sci-fi film called The Matrix. And I mention those films specifically because during their theatrical runs on, I would say, relatively small budgets at the time, they all made over $50 million each, especially, obviously, The Matrix. Something like Wishmaster 2 was unlikely able to compete, and maybe going direct to cable and eventually video was ultimately the right choice, and obviously to make some revenue back. I hate siding with companies and corporations like this, but in hindsight, if I was a producer, if I was a director, I would say it's true. As I mentioned in my Deep Blue Sea review, 1999 was an insane year for cinema. Obviously, you can read this book, best movie year ever. And frankly, horror had changed so much between Wishmaster and Wishmaster 2 that it was extremely unlikely Wishmaster 2 would have done well financially, even with a lower budget. Not only was the first film cannibalized by the success of Craven's Scream series and what it did to horror in general, horror, especially in 1999, was going through a lot of changes. I would say that if Wishmaster 2 was going to go with the trends, that the Wishmaster was probably going to bring about the end of the world, and that may have been a selling point considering the likes of Stir of Echoes, Stigmata, and End of Days, and horror films that had this end of the world and almost apocalyptic feel to them. But then again, you look at how things in horror films such as The Sixth Sense and The Blair Witch Project really tamed the audience's love of slow burns, and especially films that brought something new to the table. By the time 1999 rolled around, Wishmaster 2 wouldn't have lasted in cinemas for a month, let alone 2 like the first film did. Anyway, the film ultimately did okay, and it became a bit of a cult film on DVD and VHS. But what does that mean for the rest of the franchise? Did it sell enough for Artisan to keep going? The good news is yes. And the bad news is, dear God, at what cost? Wishmaster 3 is a perfect encapsulation of what happens when a franchise literally loses every good creative force behind it. There is such little known about the production of Wishmaster 3 that honestly, I'm going to have to state 2 main facts about this film to at least get you through the next, say, 20 to 30 minutes. Firstly, Wishmaster 3 was filmed back-to-back with the 4th entry, Wishmaster 4, The Prophecy Fulfilled, which we'll obviously talk about next. And secondly, it was shot in Canada. That's all you really need to know about the making of Wishmaster 3 to really understand what is happening throughout most of the film. Firstly, if you're one of the 6 people from the United Kingdom who watch my video, thank you for watching and good on you. Tip, tip, cheerio. You also may know that the Wishmaster 3 title is slightly different. First of all, Wishmaster 3 is called Wishmaster 3 Devil's Stone in the UK, which doesn't really make sense because the gem is never referred to as the Devil's Stone. Secondly, and this is one of my favorite facts about the film, is that the director has one of the most ridiculous names ever because it's Chris Angel. No, not that Chris Angel. But frankly, the film has that vibe to it. It is an early 2000s horror film that goes a lot into magica and Satanism and Wiccan stuff, and it's trying to be a lot cooler than it is, but it comes off with some serious mole goth energy. Thirdly, Alex Wright, the writer of this movie, got his start writing really bad action and softcore porn films, which isn't too surprising considering how things play out. And he also now directs Hallmark movies. And finally, the last fact to share with you is unfortunately that Andrew Divoff got fucked over really hard to get this film made. Divoff, who again is a strong creative force in the first 2 films, seems like a really chill and cool dude who really just wants to act and play cool characters. He was set to reprise his role and had even written a script called Wishmaster 3: The Third Millennium. As the first film had done pretty well at the end of the 20th century, this film would have been done in time for a 2000s film release. Perfect catch at the end of millennium horror films that were coming that I mentioned previously. However, Divoff's script was ultimately rejected by producers, feeling it was too ambitious and expensive, and decided to go through with the script by Alex Wright. Now, when Divoff finally had a chance to read the script from Wright, he said he hated it and left the project and ultimately, unfortunately, the franchise. I will say, while I haven't read the script in full, Divoff has talked about his Wishmaster 3 script, and it is incredible and sounds amazing, and I would love to see it one day. Divoff's original Wishmaster 3 script would have started off with a US warship getting hit by a missile somewhere in Asia, and then meanwhile at the UN, the leaders are debating what they will do and how they will react to this conflict. And then enters the Jinn. And frankly, that sounds so fucking cool. Even with the current political climate as awful and horrible and as probably tumultuous as this is going to be for the next couple of years, it sounds really sick. The Wishmaster franchise has this very nihilistic and desperate view of humanity, and frankly, using that as a creative advantage in an extremely high-stakes scenario is awesome. The first film treats this nihilistic view as a fundamental aspect of human nature, and while the second film ramps that up with characters in prison and mobsters and obviously the casino sequence, a third version looking at the true power of men in a modern context being politicians and those that wish to seek power through deals, that would be awesome. Instead, the third film focuses on, God, where do I start with this? So what is Wishmaster 3 about? It feels like at some point, someone at Artisan just panicked and they let Alex Wright put the screenplay together for Wishmaster 3 and was like, yeah, that's good, let's go with that. After what I imagine was a mild success for DVD and VHS and cable sales, I guess because it was the early 2000s, Wishmaster 3 takes what was great about Wishmaster 2 and just throws that shit in the bin like it never even fucking existed. Also, it dunks on it so hard that it like shatters the bin. But let's start about what goes down in Wishmaster 3. First and foremost, Wishmaster 3 is set in its period that it was made. It's set in the early 2000s, and you can kind of expect some of what horror cinema was like back then, but it almost feels like there's some kind of elements of it trying to be a bit of a restart for what was molded for horror back in the 1980s. Teens getting killed for fun and profit, and even kind of updating it slightly to be on a college campus. First of all, there's AJ Cook from Final Destination 2, which, hey, good for her. Sadly, Divoff, obviously, like I mentioned before, does not return as the Djinn, but instead we get character actor John Novak. Novak is a regular for film and television over the last 40 years, especially in Canadian productions. If you're a fan of anime and voice acting, you'll very likely know him from Mobile Suit Gundam Seed as Azumi, or as Kabuto from Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, which has the sickest opening theme song ever. And also end credits thing. I really like Standalone Complex for some reason. Also, he plays Steve Mason in the Death Note anime, obviously in the English dub. Now, for anybody who is in the film, I'm really, really sorry, but I only have one other person to note, which is, of course, Jason Connery, son of Sean Connery. That is real. I don't know why they keep getting actors who are sons of famous other actors, but AJ Cook, as I mentioned before, is a great actor. I really, really like her in Final Destination 2. Here she does a so-so job. She plays Diana, a college student at fictional Baxter College, and she has a tragic backstory where her parents died in a truly awesome and sick car accident, which I'm going to play in full here because I'm allowed to. Honestly, it's one of the highlights of the film. I actually thought it was going to be great when I saw this. But anyway, she's pretty depressed and has a boring boyfriend named Greg. She has a professor named Professor Barish, and Barish obviously opens up the Jinn's tomb, and here we go again. Look, unlike the previous two films, I'm not going to reiterate the plot, partially because Thought Slime did an amazing video. He's been a really, really supportive guy of this channel and of what I do, and I think he's great. So you should really watch his video about it if you want to kind of go into depth about the plot of the film. But frankly, I'm going to tell you not to bother to watch 3 and 4. And honestly, if you watch this video to the end and you want to know more about Wishmaster 3, don't watch the film. Go watch his review instead. Because frankly, I'm not going to fuck around, and I'm just going to say, no. Absolutely not. This film sucks in so many different ways. Oh, let me count those ways. First of all, there's barely any wishes, and they're barely shown on screen, which, look, would be fine if the Wishmaster films were, say, a low-budget student indie film from Canada. I would have let it off with a bit of a warning, but so many kills happen on screen, or they only show 1 or 2 seconds of it. This was going to be a direct-to-DVD horror film. What are you guys so afraid of? Literally, in the film, there are less than 10 wishes in the entire runtime, which again is like less than 90 minutes. And even then, the ones that they do show are pretty tame, not even from a visual effects perspective, but just from a filmmaking perspective. There's very few close-ups. They very, very much are about the interpretation of the audience on how bad the deaths were. And frankly, none of them make any sense. In fact, the wish at the end, which I'm not going to really talk about much here, but it's just fine. It's not really that cool. There is a little bit of stunt work, but like they bookend the opening and closing of the film mainly as a thematic element. Second of all, the acting is abysmal across the board. Except for Cook and Novak, no one here is pulling their weight, and frankly, I don't think I would have expected that much from a director called Chris Angel. Thirdly, like I mentioned previously, the effects are mediocre at best, and it's a bummer that even then we only get to see them for a couple of seconds. I don't know if the editor or the director or whomever was just ashamed of how they looked on camera, but even the ones we do see aren't super awful. They're just not amazing. They look like maybe like a first or second year effects team just trying their best. But like even then, the first two films was such a treat for visual effects and special effects and for horror fans in general. And they let those kills breathe with the effects, especially even the more grotesque ones in Wishmaster 2. And yet here, maybe you get 4 or 5 seconds. This wasn't even going to be a theatrically released film. And it's almost like they were afraid of getting above a PG-13, even though I know in the US, the film was rated R, except for in Australia where it was rated MA15+. Fourthly, the third act is it's one of the worst third acts I've ever seen in a horror film. It's so weird and absurd and just dumb and odd, and it's very much like Supernatural or Buffy, or again, it really does feel like, and I don't know how much I'm going to explore this in the 4th installment, but it does feel like back to back, since they were filmed that way, that they were backdoor pilots for a possible sci-fi Wishmaster series, which kind of would have been cool as like an idea, but it just falls off the rails so hard with all of this like angel stuff, which I guess the Jinn is a demon, so that kind of makes sense, but even then it just sounds so stupid when I say it out loud thinking about it now. Fifthly, the music and score are just so awful. Like, look, the first two films don't have the best scores, but at least they ground the film in the period of time and a tone that represents the Jinn as this ancient evil in a modern world. You kind of have certain instruments that kind of play off this Middle East and Southeast Asian vibe, but my God, the music in this film sucks so bad. The score by Daryl Bennett and Jim Guttridge feels like it was just shat out in a weekend. And look, there's also like some just weird song choices that sound like they're just your cousin's worst band. Like you wouldn't even attend their show as a joke. That's how bad it is. It's also wildly out of place for 2001. The song choices in here would have been like fine for college radio in 1995, and yes, it's set in a college, but by 2001, everybody had moved on from this very soft post-grunge alternative kind of music. Could you not get like just a really rough nu metal or like hard rock Canadian band to do one song? Is it that hard? Anyway, I guess finally, this film, even though the runtime is relatively short, here it is on screen for the full amount, but this film just loves wasting your time. The one positive I was going to say about the film is that it does explore the lore and the exposition a little bit better, and visually, at least it's on par with the first two films. That part's fine, but the worst part is just how much time it spends investigating, as if it's like trying to be a reboot or a restart for the series. I think that there is so much that AJ Cook does in terms of just trying to at least show some interest in how deep the lore of this character goes, but even then it's just not worth it, AJ. just wait a year and you'll be in one of the greatest horror franchises of all time. Just please wait. Just please wait. That being said, like I mentioned before, Novak is a good actor and does a pretty good job here, but I do have to say, compared to the first two films, it is a step down from Duvall as the Djinn. There are a few minor things he gets right about the Djinn and how he plays it as this slimy, creepy kind of dude. The makeup effects aren't amazing, but they are pretty good. I do like the fact that in the first two films, the Djinn kind of has like a Pokemon evolution kind of species vibe going. I loved how the braids of the Djinn moved in the first two films, but in this one, it's just not as good. It just feels like they just didn't have like a puppeteer or like an effects guy to really work through it. I really just hate this film so much. It was such a slog to get through, even though it's roughly the same runtime as the first two films. Like, even having to go through footage here, I really didn't want to say too much about it simply because I think it's just such a waste of your time. Like, this is the one I would 100% skip. Like, the 90 minutes feels like just 3 CW episodes just compacted into itself, like watching a 3-car pileup with a bunch of Pintos. It's like 30% a softcore film, 40% hallways and staircases, then it's like 20% CW drama just based on the dialogue and also like the weird thing with the angels and stuff, and then like maybe 10% a horror film. Does that add up? 30, 40, 20? Yeah, that's fine, I guess, if you were interested in watching this film. And again, there's like 5 actual wishes in the whole movie. And like, thank God AJ Cook ended up doing Final Destination 2 after this, and Novak had a pretty good job as a voice actor. Like, I just feel like their careers would be dead in the water if it wasn't for the fact that they were extremely talented. Finally, like I said before, I do want to give a shout out again to Scaredy Cats, who made an amazing feminist critique of Wishmaster 3, which I thought was fun and accurate. I try not to watch any other reviews when I'm putting these together, but that was just really fun. It's in the description if you want to click on that, if you didn't think that this section was accurate or enough for it. But look, I'll admit, I watched this one and I highly recommend it. It was really, really fun. I wish I could do such a deep dive on this, but again, with these franchises, I can only go as deep as these films allow. Ultimately, Wishmaster 3 drags the entire franchise down to a level I didn't think was possible for even a low-budget horror franchise like this. Not only do they make the premise for Wishmaster boring and unwatchable, it commits so many cardinal sins for bad movies with mediocre jump scares, horrible lighting, and frankly, not enough credit or time given to the visual effects team. By focusing purely on these human characters, it's great that they try to ground the story with people that are, I guess, semi-relatable in a college setting, but the film ultimately lacks any creativity, joy, gore, or anything interesting that the first two films established. I frankly would just ask you to skip Wishmaster 3. But then where does that leave the final entry in this franchise? Wishmaster 4 is the perfect I'm just kidding. Wishmaster 4 is just as bad as Wishmaster 3, but I think it's a little bit more self-aware. Now, before I explain properly why I think this entry is pretty awful in almost every aspect, I want to talk about horror films and horror sequels, specifically about what makes a good horror sequel, using my favorite horror franchise of all time. I want to talk about why great rules and great creativity is necessary to establish an escalation in your series, and a way to keep the franchise fresh and honestly provide a fantastic example for, I don't know, anybody who makes horror films and watches these. Oh my God, I am delusional. Final Destination is my favorite horror franchise, hands down. At the time of recording this, the Bloodlines trailer has just dropped, and I have not been this excited for a horror film in an extremely long time, especially a franchise horror film. Hands down, Final Destination encapsulates everything that I love about horror and will probably, hopefully, always love about horror in the way that it emphasizes the importance of creativity. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you know the thing that inspires me and fills me with joy is always seeing in cinema something that I've never seen before, let alone possibly have conceived. Essentially, how much can you show and not tell? How much creativity can go into your film, let alone your horror film, and how much do I need to care about those elements before you essentially destroy them? What are essentially just paper dolls being thrown into a shredder can be the great premise for a horror film, but ultimately how you insert those paper dolls is what's important. Well, I won't go into all of the films. That is a whole other video, which honestly, if you want that, you can give me more money on Patreon because I will make that a goal. I will say that the escalation from film to film is largely about following rules, or at least establishing those rules, adding minor addendums, adding more characters and ways to show off the creativity of the writers, directors, and performers. However, it never strays away from the originally established formula. The For Final Destination, its roots go back to almost the likes of Agatha Christie or other mystery novel writers. First of all, you set up your characters, put them in a predicament, have them escape said predicament, and then pick them off one by one in ridiculous circumstances with bodies piling up. The formula for Final Destination was very clearly set up in the Val Lewton death in the first Final Destination. While not essential to all of the deaths in Final Destination, the horrific Rube Goldberg machine that spills out over the course of 5 minutes is fascinating because of its escalation and the way that it draws deeper into the plot and characters it surrounds. It also adds a fantastic way to show visually how these things are set up to create a sense of dramatic irony and tension for the audience. You have a character, specifically Val Lewton, is packing up things in the process of moving after these horrific deaths. We're over an hour into the film, and while you're not exactly focused on how things will play out, neither is the character. You put them in a safe space, or at least a place that they can feel comfortable. Specifically, Val is in her home. You have a character who is not quite focused on what they are doing. When she starts drinking, things obviously take a turn for the worst. It exacerbates the scenario in a way that audiences can easily understand. Another thing to note is that while the tone of the first Final Destination film is much closer to a thriller than a horror, the things that are best about both genres is how filmmakers play with tension. The original writers and directors of the first Final Destination film were originally working on The X-Files. In fact, the original Final Destination script was based on an episode that they were writing for The X-Files themselves. That show also played a lot with how death and how these characters obviously played into the unnatural or supernatural circumstances. Here it plays out almost exactly the same. The characters react in a realistic way to these deadly scenarios, and in that exacerbation, you see how great and how fascinating it is for the audience to know what could possibly happen next and then take a complete right turn. Final Destination's visual language is set up so wonderfully in the first film that it carries through pretty much every single death and kill in the entire series. You have little things such as the mug breaking here, as well as the little drips that are gently focused on for these wider sequences. To add another layer, you also set up the second half of the scene with moments that play into Alex being treated as a serial killer and the cops that are tagging him through these sequences. It's played perfectly as we see how it dovetails between each portion of the character and dramatic setup. And for another example is the incredible death of Tim Carpenter in the second film. While I won't play the scene in full, the entire setup of death is wonderfully done for anybody who just hates the dentist. You have these little bits and pieces that are set up over, again, another 5-minute scene where every single element just builds on it over and over again until the final moments when the dental hygienist obviously saves him. Spoilers for, I guess, Tim Carpenter's death. Just kidding. There's nothing out of the ordinary or too ridiculous for these films, and I think it's so wonderful that they have created a playground for these writers and directors to truly make a mark on each one of those films. Except maybe Final Destination 4, but we'll get to that one day. Again, the balance between a ridiculously horrible scenario and plausible realistic is honestly a fucking bee's dick of simplicity. The level of creativity employed by these amazing effects artists, makeup artists, writers, directors, producers, the amazing teams that come together to make things so brilliant and so fun to watch on screen, especially with a crowd, especially with an audience, is so difficult. And yet they pulled it off 5 times. Maybe 4, depending on how critical you want to be. Now, with all that being said, how does Wishmaster handle its sequels and its creativity? The answer is not well at all. Okay, well, oh my god, I didn't really explain too much about Wishmaster 3 and its very, very boring, flaccid CW style plot. And I'm sorry to say about that film and this film, it just sucks. They both suck so hard. And I know I largely talked about the production of the third film, and honestly, I'm gonna have to say the same things about the fourth film. It's, again, directed by Chris Angel. What else do you want to know? I can't play that same joke again. Also, there's this weird IMDb trivia note about how the Wishmaster screwed up a wish because he was distracted. Whose side are you on, IMDb trivia guy? Anyway, the film is about these two whose names I never properly bothered learning. I'll say this about Wishmaster 3. At least it kind of has an interesting kind of tone to it and a bunch of like twists and turns that are kind of like, oh yeah, I guess. And then there's like this romanticy stuff with the angels and the sword. And this film has no idea what the fuck it wants to be. And I think it's so clear in just how it's written. The first 5 minutes feel like The Room if it was filmed by someone mildly competent and obsessed with HGTV. The film is largely about this couple, Sam and Lisa. Okay, I do remember their names, I'm sorry. He's a painter, she's a lawyer, they love each other. He gets in a horrible accident that leaves him paralyzed, and then she's just a sad lawyer, I guess. She's hoping to close this big deal. She works with this guy, Steve, who's very clearly interested in her in like a Jim and Pam kind of way, but like not really well done. Steve also just has the gin jewel for some reason. He shows up with the jewel, and frankly, it's just so exhausting. It's so exhausting thinking about how this is the setup for a Wishmaster film. Like, we're like 12 minutes into what happens in the film, and I know, like, aha, I sped it up, haha, it looks ridiculous, but like, seriously, it takes 14 minutes before the Wishmaster is revealed into the film. And like, remember in the first film how we were like 5 minutes in and the Wishmaster's here, and like, holy shit. Also, this film is like less than 90 minutes long. Like, there's also a lot of focus on Sam and Lisa, which is like fine. It's like whatever. It's like deeply cliched and it's underdeveloped. And I also just realized that the woman in the room is also called Lisa.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
And honestly, like, I think they tried to wrap a Hallmark divorce storyline around a Wishmaster film, and it's just so weird. On top of this, like the third film, there's barely any wishes whatsoever. In the first 40 minutes of the film, there's 2 wishes. That's like a wish per 20-minute ratio. The film's called Wishmaster. It's not Wish Amateur. It's not Wish Beginner. It's Wishmaster. It's like if you had a Pirates of the Caribbean film and you only showed 2 pirates a third of the way into the film. Like 50 minutes into the film, that's when Jack Sparrow kind of turns up. Then this guy comes in. I swear to God, he looks like if Dane Cook was a lawyer, which is honestly a terrifying idea to think of.
How did I not win that? I fucking stabbed this dude in the head. Fuck.
Look, I hate recapping films. I really do. And like, we've established this. Like, I think that talking about plots of films is so boring when I think that there's so much to talk about in terms of subtext and thematics and like how films are made. I think this film is awful. And while there's like really weird, like odd, funny and gory moments here and there, it's not worth your time. But I will say one good thing about this movie is the fact that the Wishmaster has a heart. Largely the problem with this film, and obviously the same thing kind of goes for Wishmaster 3, is that there's just so much CW shit. And I mean that in like a modern CW context, like the last 20 years of CW, where it's never really focused on quality. It's just focused on trying to get as much time out of you as possible through honestly poorly written drama. The acting is awful and the dialogue is hardly any better, but I will say one good thing about Wishmaster 4 is that the Djinn has like this weird character arc that I really loved and I thought was so funny. Like, it's basically he comes out, he's unleashed, and the storyline goes from like this pure joy and excitement like you get at the start of every Wishmaster film, except for these 2, that it's like, okay, let's grant some fucked up wishes. And then by like 50 minutes into the film, the Wishmaster's like, what is love? About 45 minutes into this film, after the second wish gets enacted, the film goes into like full Riverdale, just weird horror romantasy bullshit, where the Djinn is like obsessed with Lisa. And it's just this weird, almost love triangle plotline where he's like, fuck the souls, fuck the wishes, I just want to fuck Lisa. And like I mentioned in the Wishmaster 2 portion, it gets some real Psycho Gorman bullshit. And dialogue-wise, like at least Psycho Gorman is kind of self-aware and very fun and made by people who understand what they're doing. But obviously, this film is just trying to be 100% serious. And it's trying to make you care about the Wishmaster. Like, I get that he's a protagonist in, I guess, 3 out of 4 of these films, but like, I don't care. Also, it just feels like the one thing that I enjoy about the film around the Wishmaster is that it heightens it slightly. It's definitely campier and hornier than the first 3 films. I will say that. Like, even though there's like a little bit of sex and nudity in like the first 2 films, I feel like the film is trying to say, show me what that Djussi does. I think changing the character's goals halfway through the film from 1,000 souls to, does Lisa like me? Is just too funny to be taken seriously. And I frankly applaud the team behind making the Djinn look the way he does to just at least have a sense of humor about it. I get that being a Wishmaster is probably really lonely and he's been doing this for centuries, but also like kill people and take their souls. You can do both. Like, you can't be surprised that like not everyone is your friend when you're like killing all these people and you're upset about that. Oh my God. And I just remembered there's like a hunter and there's also like some more angels and demons bullshit that's a holdover from the last movie. It's just so stupid. Like, I thought that the angel stuff in the third film was like, oh, I guess we're trying to do stuff. But watch this shit. Like, this is insane.
You know, I've been waiting a long time for one of you big spenders to come in here and just step over that line.
Like, this dude looks like a buff Nathan Fielder, and then he tries to take on the djinn in the alley, and it's just so funny. It just feels like a weird episode of Charmed that went on too long, and then there's like a cutaway where like a dude has to fight a demon, and it's again like the whole angel hunting down Lisa, and then there's like an angel that's also hunting the djinn, and then Sam gets back his legs, but apparently according to IMDb he gets it wrong because the djinn was distracted by Lisa. On top of this, oh my god, I just remembered this part too. I didn't even script. I swear to God, I just remembered this. There is a part where the Wishmaster has to have a meeting with other djinns, and it's like a HR meeting, and like all of the other djinns or like whatever these demons are just like, man, you're falling in love, bro. You're down bad. It's not worth it. You just gotta cut that shit out, man. Just like you know that. It's so funny. It's so stupid. I'm literally gonna look up the time code here because I record these before I put the. Okay. Oh my god. I'm just skimming the. Okay. There's also like 10 minutes before the end of the film, and there's this whole like power of love focus. And look, that's not why I wanted to see a Wishmaster film. If I want to talk about the power of love, I'll watch About Time, or We Live in Time, or Back to the Future. I feel like love in any form does not exist in the Wishmaster universe, and it's so weird that they really just kind of focus on this in the last film. Like the first movie had like a weird situationship, like a friend zone thing, if you believe in that kind of stupid shit. The second movie has this like kind of uncomfortable but kind of sexy hot priest goth girl dynamic. Like I feel like there could be like a good book series out of that. And frankly, the last movie had couples in there, but there's barely any chemistry with anyone. So what is this? Like, why is there this whole weird divorce paraplegic storyline? Like it's those weird films that are about a guy trying to commit euthanasia but also being in love. Like, what? Why is that in a Wishmaster film? I would love to talk to Chris Angel about that. Anyway, this is how the franchise ends, with Wishmaster getting impaled on a sword, and then Sam is like dead, and then the movie ends with one of the worst songs I've ever heard. Like, it's even worse than the weird Canadian rock alternative songs from like the last movie. It does beg the question, even though I do like the Wishmaster in this film, is Wishmaster 4 any good? No! What are you kidding? Jesus Christ, did you not listen to anything I've said for like the last hour? Jesus fucking Christ, what an awful way to end a franchise. And it's such a fucking bummer that every aspect of this film is literally just about how they didn't know what to do with this franchise. This is why shooting back-to-back films is never a great idea. Like, you're not pulling off Back to the Future 2 and 3 or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. You need to take lessons from previous installments and improve on them, and they did none of that whatsoever. There's no extra creativity. There's no extra forethinking about how these characters are going to play things out or how these wishes are going to affect people. They tried to tell a really weird and confronting tale about disability, depression, survivor's guilt, and I guess the mystical power of love. And then they barely cover any of that in like a 90-minute runtime. And then they also, I guess, talk about how much djinns love women, like human women, I guess, and that's I honestly, it just makes for such a bad film. The dialogue is laughable, the effects are ridiculous, if barely seen at all. There's one good kill, which is the lawyer sequence. The film honestly looks like they were finished in the basement of a visual effects department. The makeup is fine on the djinn, like it's good, I guess, but there's barely any creativity or any good reason to watch this film unless you really want this high camp, does the djinn get to fuck Lisa kind of thing. And honestly, look, spoilers, he kind of does. I think for a film where there's barely any wishes, barely anyone trying, and it has worse acting than the last 3 films combined, I can barely get past the fact that there's also so much sex in this film. Obviously, I've had to blur almost all of it, but it's also deeply gratuitous for no good reason. Like, I get, yeah, like, sex your film up, maybe it's gonna hit with a teen audience, but even then, like, by 2002, like, you know, you just go on the internet by that point. Like, it just seems so stupid. Even if like one of those scenes is also for like plot reasons, because I guess they were trying to set up maybe a Wishmaster Rosemary's Baby thing, but even then that's not even like properly explained either.
Do you wonder if a woman has ever wanted to have sex with Mickey Mouse?
No, I've never wondered that, because women want to have sex with all the worst things. Men just want to have sex with women or men, but women want to have sex with horses. A windmill.
What, dude?
Yeah.
Wishmaster 4 is just properly gross, weird, poorly edited, poorly shot, deeply stupid film that I don't think any normal functioning human or horror fan could decree it as a good film. Wishmaster 4 is like 15% softcore pornography, 55% early 2000s CW TV show, 20% wishes, and like 10% a divorce story. I cannot recommend this film to anyone unless you're a really, 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 really big fan of the series or just terrible films. And even then, that's a hell of a stretch with a 90-minute runtime where almost nothing happens for a quarter of that runtime. And with that was the end of the Wishmaster franchise. There's never been any proper talks about whether or not it would come back, but the crazy thing after doing all of this research and going in depth on a lot of these films is how it just gently connects and affects each film in its own way, for better or worse. Wishmaster overall, like the title of this video essay suggests, is a forgotten franchise. There's never been any serious discussions of a reboot or a sequel or a screboot. The last thing I could find was Andrew Divoff talking about Wishmaster 5, but that was back in 2017. I think he and everybody even associated with this film has moved on. I couldn't even tell you who other than Peter Atkins holds the rights to these films. A novelization of the original script was released in 2020 with only minor celebration to everybody who worked on that film. But even then, Divoff has done some great work since he left the Wishmaster franchise. He actually played M, aka Mephistopheles, in an adaptation of the underground superhero comic Faust, which I own on DVD and I think is deeply fucked up. And if you really want to see Divoff in a Wishmaster type role, absolutely watch that. It is an underrated horror film, and honestly, the body horror in it is insane. I think even Red Letter Media covered it. Also, Divoff played Lev Kravchenko in the Call of Duty Black Ops series, which, again, I haven't played for 15 years, but I mean, good for him. He's getting video game money. Kurtzman still does effects in amazing films. He hasn't really directed anything since 2010. Kurtzman actually works really, really closely with Kevin Smith. Over the last 2 decades, he's brought a lot of monstrosities and great gory visual effects to his life, especially Justin Long as the walrus in the movie Tusk is freaking awesome. I really love that. Kurtzman actually also even got to work with Divoff again in the 2007 mad scientist horror flick The Range, which I've only seen the trailer for, but it looks kind of cool. I do think that there is something to be said about this horror franchise, and that while the first 2 films are these ridiculous, gory, creative, odd pieces of horror history that honestly may not have got its respect until like the DVD versions came out in the early 2000s, but I will say that there's a glut of terrible Evil Genie, Evil Wish films that are out there that frankly aren't that good, and I think it's so funny and so weird to see so many of them, and most of them kind of don't even have good wishes in a lot of them. I've skimmed through some of these films and like even just looking at the trailers for Wishcraft, The Wisher, which is also known as Spliced, The Monkey's Paw, not to be confused with The Monkey that also came out this year, Toby Hooper's Djinn, which I guess uses the whole Djinn thing, Red Sands, a film called Djinns, another film called Djinn but without the D, Dabe, Curse of the Djinn, The Djinn from 2021, 16 Wishes, and obviously one of the most infamous horror films from the last 10 years, Wish Upon.
Wait, you dig on multiverses?
I think that there is a lot to be said about the Evil Genie or Evil Wish idea and concept. It's just insane that no one has ever put it to such a wonderful level of creativity and insanity as these first 2 Wishmaster films. Ultimately, the question is the Wishmaster a worthwhile creature in the great horror canon of cinema? I truly believe so, but maybe just for the first 2 films. I think Kurtzman, Atkins, and a lot of the incredibly talented people laid such a fantastic groundwork for a in-depth and unique horror franchise, and I think that due to greed, poor planning, or just simple mundanity, it dug this franchise into a hole it never needed to be in. I think if you look at in from a modern context, the likes of Art the Clown, The Tall Man, or even Chud, you can have a great horror franchise that has these characters, and I think if these 3 are allowed to exist, why not the Djinn? I think ultimately, while I know not many people look back at Wishmaster fondly, at least from an overall franchise perspective, I still enjoyed looking back at this franchise and the piece of horror history it is, as well as a transitional period from the 90s to the 2000s. Getting to know how these films came to be is honestly been a joy, and I always love looking into these deep dives simply because I think there's more room for discussion. I always feel like there's more room for this franchise if a reboot were to come out one day, whether it's Blumhouse or Universal or whomever is willing to put up the money to buy the rights from Lionsgate. That would be amazing. But for the love of God, put more wishes into those films.
Wishes.
Hey! And that's it. I really, really loved talking about this. I'm so sorry this took forever to come out. I had to move. I was having problems with my job. There was so much happening over the last 6 months that I'm frankly so glad to be putting this together and putting this out. Simply because I love doing these videos. It's just that it takes a lot out of me. And honestly, I love being as thorough as possible when it comes to trying to find as many sources and as many interesting takes and pieces that these films can have. I try to make sure that they come out in a time timely manner, and obviously that was not the case for this one. But I will say that I have to start working on the next video essay. Hopefully it's a lot quicker. Also, if you really want to see me do an entire deep dive, it would probably be like 2 hours long on the Final Destination franchise, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/HalParrison. Also, just like and subscribe. I know that isn't always great. Also, tell me what your favorite Wishmaster film is, as well as your favorite Wish from the series in the comments below. That would be so awesome. Also, again, shout out to Thought Slime, who did reply to me when I asked him if he had any extra takes about the Wishmaster franchise. Incredibly helpful, incredibly great person. Go watch their videos, go subscribe to their channel if you want. But thank you so much, and I wish you have a fantastic day.